The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Oversight of the Proxy Advisory Industry. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the Chair for inclusion into the record. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Mr. Shostal and Mr. Friedman, I appreciate you appearing before the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee this afternoon, and I believe this is the first time that your firms have testified before our committee, so congratulations. I'd like to start by addressing an argument made yesterday by some friends on the other side of the aisle that Republicans are interfering with free market principles and that any discussion on ESG is a threat to capitalism. That could not be further from the truth. We're holding these hearings to, in fact, defend capitalism and keep social policies out of the boardroom. Social policies should be debated in Congress, in which we do often and robustly, and in state capitals, but not arbitrarily decided by third parties. Now to the topic at hand. Currently, proxy advisory firms play an outsized role in our capital markets. However, as the Biden administration continues to pursue ESG-related policies through regulation and rulemaking, often by bypassing Congress, their influence has grown. Recent data suggests that on average, a recommendation from ISS or Glass Lewis can swing a shareholder proposal vote by as much as 30%. You're very powerful. Today, you will hear from our witnesses that the proxy advisory industry provides sound, independent recommendations to investors in order to maximize shareholder value. In reality, proxy advisory firms have hijacked the shareholder process, becoming the de facto standard setters for corporate governance policies in the United States. And many questions remain. Today, the committee will seek to understand what metrics proxy advisory firms use to measure the impact of environmental, social, and governance policies and how they maximize the long-term value. In addition, we will explore whether the proxy advisory firms have sufficient oversight and transparency, giving shareholders confidence that the recommendations being provided are actually free from political and social influence. Finally, the subcommittee hopes to identify the factors used by the proxy advisory firms when making voting recommendations. Mr. Shostal, Mr. Friedman, in the past, your firms have declined to disclose your historical data and how you formulate your voting policies and recommendations. Transparency ensures accuracy and accountability. We have to live that every day up here. And that is the only way that your firms can promote a fair and reliable proxy process. And of course, under the chairmanship of Gary Gensler, the SEC has injected themselves into the process, which should be a surprise to no one. Recent actions taken by the Commission have made it nearly impossible for companies to defend themselves against ESG proposals, which have grown to over 60% of all proposals, shareholder proposals in 2023. The simple truth is this: ISS and Glass Lewis seem to bear none of the consequences their recommendations have on companies, and in my opinion, operate without sufficient transparency. Ultimately, both ISS and Glass Lewis really don't answer to shareholders or act in a fiduciary manner with a responsibility to maximize returns on the investments of retail investors. Prioritizing political policies over sound economic analysis undermines the fundamental purpose of the proxy voting system. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today, and I yield back the balance of my time. And now I will recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Oversight, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for appearing today as well. Mr. Chairman, the title of this hearing is Oversight of the Proxy Advisory Industry. However, I believe a better title would be Republican Overreach into the proxy advisory industry as a guise to promote climate change denial, to promote the end of diversity and inclusion programs, as well as to promote overreach into corporate governance. By way of example, Republicans are using proxy advisory oversight as a guise to engage in climate change denial at a time when major insurance companies are leaving Florida and California due to cost of doing business related to climate change. Oversight is being used as a guise to end lawful, socially acceptable corporate diversity and inclusion programs, as evidenced by the fact that my Republican colleagues in leadership have ended the Financial Services Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion at a time when it is still needed to encourage diversity in the financial services industry. This is further evidenced by the fact that my Republican colleagues continue to seat all white males as panel witnesses when there are women and people of color capable, competent, and qualified to testify. Oversight of the proxy advisory industry is but an overreach into corporate governance to prevent shareholders who are owners from having their policy opinions become policy after all shareholder owners have had an opportunity to vote. Oversight of the proxy advisory industry is little more than overreach as a means to hold back valuable climate change policies, roll back diversity and inclusion efforts, and take back the right of shareholder owners to have a voice in corporate governance. Sadly, too many of my Republican colleagues are marching to the beat of a hold back, roll back, take back, discombobulated drummer at a time when our country needs to march forward. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, the gentleman from Tennessee, the Vice Chairman of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, Mr. Rose, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Huizenga. Since 2003, elements of the Securities and Exchange Commission's regulatory regime have acted to entrench investment advisors' reliance on, and perhaps even the need for, proxy advisory firms. Our witnesses today, Glass Lewis, a for-profit company owned by a Canadian private equity firm and a Canadian businessman, and ISS, a majority German-owned for-profit company, are largely unregulated and have significant control over shareholder voting in U.S. capital markets. The rise of proxy advisory firms and the outsized influence they wield have real consequences for investors, the vast majority of whom are interested in maximizing returns, not on identity politics or studying the weather. I am interested in hearing from our witnesses today about their voting policies and patterns, their conflicts of interest, and whether their recommendations are in the best interests of Main Street investors. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
With that, we are going to move forward. So we are going to be hearing from our witnesses today. Mr. Stephen Friedman. Mr. Friedman is the General Counsel at the Institutional Shareholder Service. Mr. Eric Shostal is the Senior Vice President of Research and Engagement at Glass Lewis. Professor Shiva Rajgopal is the Kester and Burns Professor of Accounting and Auditing at Columbia Business School, and I believe was in front of our Capital Markets Subcommittee just last year. So we thank you for taking the time to be here. You'll be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony, and without objection, your written statements will be made part of the permanent record. Mr. Friedman, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairman Huizenga, Ranking Member Green, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to testify today on behalf of Institutional Shareholder Services, also known as ISS. My name is Stephen Friedman, and I'm ISS's General Counsel. I've worked for ISS for nearly 20 years, having originally joined the company in September 2003, with a brief break in my tenure in the early 2010s. Cognizant of the interest this subcommittee has shown on this topic, and also of recently proposed legislation to reform the proxy advisory industry, I hope my testimony today contributes to a constructive and fact-based discussion about proxy advisors by, number one, explaining ISS's important but limited role in the proxy voting process, number two, describing how ISS is currently regulated in the United States and our responsibilities as a fiduciary to our institutional investor clients, and number three, conveying the facts about the work that ISS has been privileged to do in serving our institutional investor clients since our founding over 35 years ago. Today, ISS is a leading provider of corporate governance and investment research, data, and analytics to the financial market participants around the globe. As was the case in our founding in 1985, proxy advisors remain a market-based solution to common proxy voting challenges that are faced by institutional investors. We have seen market forces at work and entrants come and go, including most recently the launch of a new proxy advisory service by a self-described anti-ESG asset management firm. As part of our core offerings, ISS provides institutional investors with objective, timely, and expert proxy research and vote recommendations based on the proxy voting policies selected by the clients. In many cases, our institutional investor clients develop custom policies that reflect their individual investment objectives and strategies and their own approaches to capital stewardship. In fact, during calendar year 2022, approximately 80% of the shares that were processed by ISS on behalf of our clients were linked to a client's custom policy. For clients who choose not to use a custom policy, ISS offers a range of proxy voting policy options, including what we call a benchmark voting policy, as well as a range of specialty voting policies. By offering this range of options, ISS empowers our clients to exercise their rights as shareholders in accordance with their own investment parameters and risk-return assessments. Put simply, ISS and other proxy advisors play an important but narrow role in the proxy voting process. It's the client who creates or selects the voting policies and guidelines that reflect their own fiduciary obligations and investment strategies. Our job is to synthesize data, analyze proxy statements, and formulate vote recommendations that flow from the client's chosen policies and guidelines. Proxy voting is a form of investment advice. ISS is a registered investment advisor under the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. This statute and related rules provide a mature and comprehensive regulatory regime that covers virtually every aspect in our business and that effectively addresses transparency, accountability, accuracy, and conflict mitigation in the proxy advisory system. Our fiduciary duties follow the contours of our relationship with our clients, and so it's important to understand what those relationships entail and what they don't entail. ISS does not choose the ballot or agenda items upon which we render advice. ISS provides our services only to clients who have hired us to do so, and then we analyze only the companies and the items, the issues that are designated by our clients in accordance with their voting policies and their selected guidelines. The voting decision for each resolution at a company meeting is the responsibility of the company's shareholders. Our business model rests on factual accuracy. Our incentives are to ensure that our investor clients have access to accurate information, and thus our incentives align with the interests of both institutional investors and the companies and the issuers that we cover. Our record of accuracy is one of which we are proud. A 2016 GAO report concluded similarly, and the congressional and SEC records are replete with commentary from investors who affirm that conclusion. Our clientele is not monolithic, and accordingly, neither are our services. Investors have different investment strategies, risk tolerances, and time horizons. Even when investors' ultimate objectives are the same, the investment strategies they pursue to achieve those objectives may differ. And even when they pursue the same investment strategy, investors often have different views on the relevance of specific information to their risk-return analyses and then different ways of assessing how proxy voting serves their investment goals. This includes the extent to which environmental, social, or governance factors affect financial returns and how such considerations align with their underlying goals and mandates. This diverse mix of investment approaches is a hallmark of our capital markets and makes them robust. We are proud to serve our investor clients in a prudent, open, and honest manner and consistent with our duties. And with that, I thank you again for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Mr. Shostal. You are now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral remarks.
Thank you. Chairman Huizenga, Ranking Member Green, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify here today on behalf of Glass Lewis. My name is Eric Shostal, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Research and Engagement. Glass Lewis was founded in 2003 to provide competition and proxy research in the voting industry. We are proud to have grown to a company that now serves over 1,300 institutional investors globally. Glass Lewis is not a political or an advocacy organization. We are a business that helps our clients, sophisticated institutions that own and manage shares in companies, to make voting decisions in an efficient and effective manner. Glass Lewis is committed to adhering to all times to a high standard of associated with our fiduciary duty to our institutional investor clients. Proxy voting is a means by which shareholders have a say in the companies they own. It's fundamental, long-standing part of the system of corporate law that has served this country so well. No one is required to hire a proxy advisory firm. Institutional investors often do so because it makes more sense for them to outsource the task of reading and analyzing the proxy statements of potentially thousands of companies they are asked to vote on each year. This, of course, lowers costs while allowing them to be prudent stewards and mitigate risks to their beneficiaries and end clients who may be pension plan participants or retail investors for saving for college or retirement. I came to Glass Lewis to lead its research efforts about 3 years ago after spending part of my career as a stewardship professional on the institutional investor side. Serving as the head of research team at Glass Lewis has been an extraordinary privilege. I work alongside some of the most hardworking, experienced, and talented colleagues I've come across in my nearly 20 years in corporate governance. And having just completed my 3rd proxy season in this role, I'm truly in awe of the skill, their work ethic, and their dedication to our mission. This past year has seen an organized campaign to push back on shareholder votes on environmental, social, and to a lesser extent, corporate governance shareholder proposals. And to be clear, we do not file shareholder proposals, and we have no control over what types of proposals shareholders submit. Nor do we decide which proposals go to a vote, and that is a process, as you know, that is governed by the SEC, which has allowed more than what we called some E&S proposals onto a company's ballots in recent years. Even with this recent increase, however, shareholder proposals represent about 1.3% of the proposals we provide voting research and analysis on each year. A subset of these relate to E&S issues. In recent years, Glass Lewis benchmark policy has supported about 40 to 50% of such proposals. Why do we support these proposals? We do so because many of our clients see these issues as material risk factors that need to be considered as a prudent fiduciary to mitigate risk and to promote long-term economic interest of shareholders. As a state treasurer explained at a recent House hearing, I quote, "This approach is backed by academic research, but it's also common sense. Companies that value their workers have less turnover and higher productivity. Companies that build strong governance structures will be more resilient and valuable over the long term. Companies that prepare for changing weather patterns and changing market demands will be better protected from physical and transition risks." Consistent with this, our benchmark policy clearly explains, and I quote, "Glass Lewis evaluates all environmental and social issues through a lens of long-term shareholder value," unquote. Not politics, not wokeness, but shareholder value. Our benchmark policy and our record of recommendations under it are simply not consistent with the claims that we are doing this to further some environmental or social agenda. At the same time, I do want to emphasize that much of our current debate rests on the basic misunderstanding about how proxy advisors work, what our benchmark policy is. No Glass Lewis client is required to vote under our benchmark policy, and most, in fact, do not do so. Our benchmark policy is just one voting option our clients can choose. Because our clients do not all have the same investment strategies or views on proxy voting issues, Glass Lewis offers clients a menu of voting options, from a climate policy to a Catholic policy that reflects the unique fiduciary responsibilities of the Catholic institutions, to a corporate governance-focused policy for shareholders that are more skeptical of material E&S issues. In fact, most of our clients use our custom voting policy that aligns with their votes and their own views and investment strategies. Our role is to provide objective research to help our clients vote as they see fit, and we take this responsibility very seriously, and we're proud of the work that we do on behalf of our clients. I thank you again for the opportunity to be here today, and I would be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, appreciate that. And Professor Rajgopal, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you to Subcommittee Chair Huizenga, Ranking Member Green, as well as the other members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify before you today on a topic of utmost importance, the state of U.S. corporate governance and the role that proxy advisors play in that debate. My name is Shiva Rajgopal, and I'm the Kester and Burns Professor of Accounting and Auditing at Columbia Business School. It's an absolute honor and a treat to be here. So virtually every testimony that I've seen and read from the opponents of ESG and proxy advisors appears to assume 4 things. Management always works to maximize shareholder value. Management's decision horizons are perfectly aligned with the shareholders' investment horizon. Management knows who its shareholders are and what they actually want. and managerial accountability to its capital providers is as good as it can ever be, and all is well with the world. Now, I have substantial doubt about each of these premises. The state of US corporate governance is not as perfect as assumed for several reasons. In any company that is in a stock index of note, let's say the S&P 500 or the Russell 1000 or the 3000, a large portion of the equity is held by passive asset managers who may not have the time or the incentives to understand the idiosyncratic governance-related problems of each company they vote on. CEO pay, on average, still does not track performance, in my view, despite vigorous assertions to the contrary by management. I'll just cite 3 examples. Most CEO pay in the US follows the so-called competitive pay policy model that gives CEOs more shares when stock price is low and vice versa. So that policy severs the link between CEO pay and performance. Second, CEO pay over their tenures is barely different for underperforming firms relative to the others. Finally, in around a third of the companies that we looked at, managers got equity at discounted prices even when they destroyed shareholder value. Observable characteristics of boards increasingly look homogeneous or similar on account of regulations, perhaps proxy advisory guidelines, and social norms. What boards actually do in the boardroom is unobservable to outsiders, and the consequences of their poor decision-making may not be obvious for years. So what is to be done with the topic at hand, proxy advisors? So proxy advisors are certainly not perfect by any means, so let me start with my concerns. We currently effectively have a duopoly of 2 agencies, and we need to find ways to get others to enter the space. It's unclear whether they have adequate staff to monitor governance issues of 4,000 stocks trading in the US and many more overseas. Whether their consulting business subsidizes the advice business is also unclear. And for my taste, I think proxy advisors are still more deferential to management than warranted. But having said that, I support some initial regulations, such as asking them to register with the SEC. The recent SEC rulemaking already requires more detailed and standardized conflict of interest disclosures for ISS and Glass Lewis. ISS, as you heard, is already registered with the SEC, and I believe Glass Lewis is not. But I suggest caution beyond that point. If you hobble proxy advisors too much, the feeble health of shareholder democracy would simply suffer a body blow. Some institutions will simply opt out of voting on proxy proposals, making management even less accountable. This could further exacerbate highly concerning trends in executive compensation, which proxy advisors, to their credit, have helped to address by curbing egregious pay packages and highly compromised board structures. Hence, I oppose provisions that simply add more costs to institutional investors monitoring management, including those that ask for an appointment of an ombudsman, management suing a proxy advisor, singling out ESG funds or ESG proposals for special punitive treatment, or provisions that make it harder to table repeat proposals, or those that require advisors to seek management input on advisor recommendations. We must remember that proxy advisors are paid for by the customers they serve, the institutional investors. And as far as I can tell, the paying customers are not the ones asking for more regulation of proxy advisors. So enabling and facilitating efficient shareholder engagement is a market-based solution to a market-derived demand for enforcing managerial accountability. So in closing, I'd reiterate that any bill that makes proxy advisory services or voting more onerous is a step backward in seeking accountability from corporate managers, which ultimately eventually helps, as you know, retail investors. A reasonable compromise is to take a few regulatory steps in terms of registration, maybe support oversight by the SEC and institutional investors to encourage continued improvement in the quality and the accountability of proxy advisors. So the state of US corporate governance is not as rosy as often projected. Anything that interferes with shareholder democracy obstructs the ability of institutions to seek corporate accountability, which in turn hurts the pocketbooks of retail investors and the retirees' investments. Thank you. Looking forward to questions.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now turn to member questions, and the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. I do want to say thanks again to our witnesses for appearing here today. I will note to the staff, add climate denier to the list of fantasy accusations. I will note that I am one of the founding members of the Conservative Conservative Climate Caucus, which is pursuing free market solutions rather than just simply government cudgels to address any climate issues. So, Mr. Friedman, in your testimony, you referenced ISS's custom voting policies. I'd like to better understand what ISS's process for customizing these policies is. In general, how similar are the custom policies to the benchmark policies?
Excuse me, Congressman, thank you for that question. The answer is that it really depends on the client and what their interests are, and that really is our focal point.
Okay, are those custom policies similar to each other? I mean, we're only able to see on your website a few of those policies, and none of them are custom.
Right, well, the custom policies belong to our clients, and they are, as the name implies, customized to them. The range of customization really is a function of how each client looks at these.
So is there, just help me understand, is there a menu of options for investors to choose from? Again, that's not on your website, so somebody has to obviously contact you.
Sure, and we have folks, a custom analyst team that works with clients to understand where their focal points are. The issues that really get addressed in any policy or ultimately are the issues that show up on a ballot.
I'm reminded of the saying of Henry Ford when it regarded the Model T, which is you can have any color you want as long as it's black. I guess we're trying to understand whether there actually is choices and options in that. So, Mr. Shostal, let me turn to you. In 2022, Glass Lewis based its recommendations in part on whether a company is adequately pursuing, quote, broader goals defined as, quote, net zero emission goals. What financial or economic analysis did Glass Lewis undertake before including this in its recommendations?
Thank you, Mr. Huizenga. If you could clarify, is that a statement from our policy?
Yes, I believe that it is, yes.
So when we discuss in our U.S. policy guidelines, I would clarify that a lot of the discussions that we provide are clarifications in terms of our thinking around how a board should be responding to climate risk. And really, we look at a range of options. How does the board oversee climate risk, for example? What sort of goals and targets?
Materiality may not necessarily be a part of it.
If I may, actually, absolutely it does, because one of the points that we look at is, for example, does a company set greenhouse gas goals targets? And that speaks directly to, I think, a lot of what we've talked about, Scope 3 emissions, and there are costs associated with those, and we speak to those.
I'm gonna move on somewhat, but I'd like to talk through a specific example. This year, ISS supported a shareholder proposal that Toyota disclose its lobbying related to climate change. This was brought by a Danish firm and some other environmental groups out of Europe. Glass Lewis did not recommend support for this proposal. So, Mr. Friedman, can you walk me through very quickly the economic analysis ISS performed to conclude that having Toyota disclose its climate-related lobbying was the economic interests of the company and its shareholders?
So, Congressman, I'm not familiar with the particulars of that example that you're citing.
Okay.
But again,
That's fine. That's an acceptable answer. Mr. Shostal, are you able to explain your company's analysis and reached a very different conclusion?
Yeah, I think it's quite simple. I mean, so many of these issues are governance principles, and when we think about political spending or lobbying shareholder proposals, it's about good governance. Is the company managing well its approach to political spending? We are completely agnostic as to how a company spends its money, absolutely, but it's about transparency.
Was there economic analysis done?
On a lot of issues that we provide recommendations on, whether it's how many meetings a director attends, there may not be an economic.
Coming from Michigan, I know the car industry pretty well, and there's a huge debate within the auto industry about hybrids versus electric vehicles, and many people believe that Toyota, this was viewed as a punishment for them not being aggressive enough in EVs because they believe strongly in hybrid, and they believe that that is actually the way of the future. So, again, I'm concerned that the economic analysis of this is where we're losing so much of the impact of where this is going. And that it's these types of things that lead many of us to conclude that it is political or policy or social policy that drives it rather than economic analysis. My time has expired. With that, per his tradition, the ranking member will pass his first initial time off to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, who is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to the ranking member, I would just argue social policy is economic policy. It's a business imperative. It's a reality. we're sitting here having a hearing, and it's a hearing on environmental sustainable governance, but it's really about anti-ESG. And I just really find it astounding that this is what we're taking our time up as a committee when our constituents want to know about so many other important issues that we're not addressing. The rights of shareholders to take a vested interest in the company they invest in are intrinsic to the idea of partial ownership. If we're going to begin to limit the ability for shareholders to affect the corporations they own, then are they truly owners? During the shareholder voting season, investors should be able to focus on whatever values they decide. I don't believe that these proxy advisory firms are hounding down edicts from on high, and frankly, I don't believe the government should be either. If a shareholder believes a value set is crucial to the financial health of their company, then why should we prevent them from obtaining that information? Those types of short-sighted attempts to limit disclosures will actually prevent investors from making informed decisions, economic decisions, business imperative decisions. One of the starkest examples of information with a direct relationship to returns on equity is a company's diversity. Every day, our country grows more diverse, and it's about time that the C-suites and our boardrooms in corporate America caught up to the country that they hope to conduct business with. While I would say that this is a noble goal in its own right, it's also simply good business. I've worked with corporate America on diversity, equity, and initiatives promoting workforce. I ran the largest job training program in the state of Nevada for 10 years before I came to Congress, in partnership with all the major hotels in Las Vegas and the biggest union. I know the importance of diversity. It's a strength. And yet, this Congress, led by Speaker McCarthy and those on the other side, are choosing to use it as a wedge issue and not an asset. When businesses are all across the country were suffering during the pandemic, Research Institute Board Ready found that companies with diverse boards grew by 4%. Unlike every other cohort that could be assembled, these companies actually came out of that turbulent time stronger than before. So, Professor Rajgopal, I would like to take a moment to examine the link between diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts and financial performance. In your experience, do you think that these companies are stronger because they have diverse leadership, or do you think these strong companies have diverse leadership because they understand the financial benefits to expanding the lived experience of their C-suite?
So, Congressman, the way to link...
Rather quickly, because I only get a few minutes every time I'm on this panel.
So I would say yes, and the link is through corporate culture, and corporate culture has been shown to affect all kinds of good things about a company: innovation, productivity, compliance, ethical behavior, and performance in general.
For investors, does that distinction matter?
Certainly it does. I mean, the state of corporate culture is probably one of the biggest unrecognized off-balance sheet assets, I would say.
And why would it be material to an asset manager to examine the human capital of a company prior to investing in them?
I know several hedge funds that actually make a lot of money filtering on corporate culture. So clearly it's material to at least those hedge funds.
Mr. Friedman, does ISS make the final decision on how a shareholder votes on a proposal, or are your recommendations non-binding?
The clients control their vote.
Could you discuss in depth how investors are even able to tailor the recommendations they receive from your benchmark policy?
Yeah, so Congressman, thank you. Conceptually, the ability to customize, to take a view on any particular issue that shows up on the ballot really is the free choice of the client. And they can look at issues such as...
Free choice.
Correct.
Free choice
That's
of
correct.
the client, of the investor, of the shareholder.
That's correct.
And we're having a hearing that would do what? Attempt to take that away from free choice, from the party that claims to be about
Gentleman's time has
freedom.
expired.
I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and to our witnesses today, I want to thank you for taking time to be with us. I'd like to reference back yesterday, if I could please, before the full committee here, Financial Services. Ted Allen, Vice President, Public Policy and Advocacy for the Society of Corporate Governance, spoke to this committee and stated that, and this is a question for all three of you, stated that the society conducted a member survey in 2019 and found that 42% of its members reported or noticed errors in the proxy firm's research that served those companies. What would each of you say back to that?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question.
Yes, sir.
I would say I'm not familiar with that particular study, but I can say that that statistic that was cited does not reconcile with the work and the assessments we do, because we do look at errors. I mean, as I said earlier, what's critical is getting it right. That's what our clients who are...
So it's not material to you, sir?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Sessions. I'm actually struck by that because we're actually members of the Society of Corporate Governance, and we, as you know, we welcome engagement with them. So we would be very happy to hear more about that.
So it would
But
not...
I would say that it's actually not consistent at all with what we're
Not
hearing.
consistent with your...
With what we're hearing back from the corporates. We engage with over 1,000 corporates a year. We do not get that level of feedback.
Thank you. Professor, do you have a feeling about this statement?
Yeah, in my experience, it's probably a handful, less than 1%. So are these errors or are these differences of opinion?
Thank you. Gentlemen, the first two gentlemen, please, that represent companies, are your results audited by any outside firms?
The results of the reports themselves,
Your work?
there's not an audit of our proxy research.
So no outside firm audits your work?
That is correct. Not in the traditional sense. We do have what we call
Well, let the record reflect there is no audit of your work, sir.
On an individual basis, as you know, a season is so compressed, it would be nearly unworkable to audit every proxy paper. But I will say that we are members of best practices principles, providers on shareholder research that does review our policies.
If you could go back just for a second.
I'm sorry?
Go back, the mic cracked for a minute, if you could please say that again.
Thank you. It would be unworkable to review every single proxy paper given the condensed proxy season, as you know, over 3 months. We have to evaluate about 4,000 companies. But I would say that we are, audited in the context that we are members of the best practices principles, providers on shareholder voting and research. There's an
Yes, sir.
independent
Well,
oversight
I am in
committee.
no way offering any observations about it. I just simply ask questions. And your suggestion that you've given me, both of you, is that neither of your firms are audited by any outside firm. I would like to say that you being here today is important for us to ask questions. And I appreciate the chairman for bringing you here, but I think that the sensitivity related to these, I'm going to send you both a copy of the presentations that were made yesterday so that it would allow you an opportunity to see what this committee is being told and provided, which would include amounts of times and numbers of people who provide feedback on proxies. And I think that it is very important for us to pay attention. This is voting, is what it is, and it's corporate governance at its very essence. And I think that I'm delighted that our young chairman has taken time to have you here today. I will pass you a letter in the next week or so and would ask that you respond back to it of your viewpoints about the findings that we were provided yesterday. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman,
Will the gentleman yield?
I would yield.
Briefly? Okay, I appreciate that. I did have one other quick example that we had. I was cut myself off with my time. when we're talking about Toyota, but we've also seen similar conflicts between Glass Lewis and ISS regarding shareholder proposals at Occidental, ConocoPhillips, Phillips 66, and Equinor. And that is the type of thing we need to dig into. The time has expired. And with that, the chair recognizes the ranking member, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Professor Rajgopal, it has been suggested that proxy advisors are puppet masters, controlling how asset managers or institutional investors vote their shares. It has also been suggested that proxy advisors have undue influence on shareholder engagement. What are your views on this? Are the investor clients of proxy advisors required to follow proxy advisor recommendations?
So, no, because, in my experience, most of the big institutional investors and even the medium-sized ones have their own research teams. So they probably use input that these two gentlemen's firms give them, but they don't necessarily mechanically follow some of that work. And if I may, I think there's an issue with correlation and causation. So let's say you're a doctor and you think I should lose weight, okay, and you've done this based on your blood tests and, whatever. I know what I eat, and I know I don't exercise, and I know I need to lose weight. Is that mechanical voting? So, if you just look at the data, it looks like you're asking me to lose weight. I've come to the conclusion I should lose weight, but this is just correlation. It may not be causation.
Thank you very much. You and I discussed this yesterday at the roundtable I held, and I want to visit this issue again for the record. As you know, SEC's proposed climate risk disclosure rule applies to only publicly listed companies. Would you comment on the benefits of extending these disclosure requirements to other similarly situated companies like privately held operating companies or companies that are owned by private equity funds? How would such disclosure inform and benefit the investors in those companies?
So if high emission companies are seen as bad by public investors, this opens up, as we discussed in the technical jargon, a market for arbitrage. So these assets effectively get sold to private owners, and then they effectively escape the reporting system. So we do have the EPA, which does a little bit along these dimensions, but not enough. And if I may talk a little bit about private equity in general, I mean, there's good private equity and there's bad private equity. Good private equity makes money by squeezing out operational efficiencies, and that's fantastic. We want, good allocation of resources. Bad private equity makes money by socializing costs, financial engineering, sale leasebacks, dividend recaps, and we need to know which is which. And right now we have none of that information because this is completely opaque. So some disclosure would help.
Thank you. I'd like to end my questions by asking you to discuss the benefits of competition in our capital markets and the need to mitigate or eliminate conflicts of interest. Some have argued that we need more perspectives on proxy votes, that the proxy advisory industry isn't sufficiently competitive, and that there are some needed fixes to ensure conflicts of interest are mitigated when proxy advisory firms offer consultant services to corporate management. Are these real risks?
Well, I haven't seen their financial statements, so I don't know whether the conflict of interest issue is real or not, but we have historical precedent, let's not forget. I mean, the audit industry, remember under Sarbanes-Oxley, was actually required to decouple consulting and auditing. So it's theoretically possible, hence my statement earlier that we should probably look for some disclosures along those lines.
Well, are reforms needed in the space?
Say again?
Reforms, are they needed?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Clayton SEC did put in something about standardized conflict of interest rules. So maybe we should look at those disclosures. Maybe that's enough for now, but at least we need to have a conversation about that for sure. Yeah.
So I guess further, how do we ensure we don't break what's working for our markets?
No, I agree. I mean, hence I said, the state of US governance is not as rosy as it looks. And you might effectively cut your nose to spite your face or whatever. The bigger problem is the state of corporate accountability. We can fix proxy advisors here and there, tweak a little bit, but let's not forget the bigger issue. This should be a hearing about the state of US governance, US corporate governance, in my view.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. With that, the Chair of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, Mrs. Wagner from Missouri, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, much like you did, I'd like to start prior to my questioning by setting the record straight. We have heard many erroneous accusations over the past 2 days from my friends on the other side of the aisle that we are somehow seeking to thwart the free market and upend capitalism. That is categorically false, Mr. Chairman. What we are seeking is more accountability and transparency in the proxy process by the duopoly of proxy advisor firms testifying before us today. It was, I will remind everyone, a Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt, who was made famous from trust busting. So it is definitely in line with free market capitalism to stop monopolies and duopolies created by the administrative state. As one of our witnesses in yesterday's hearings, Mr. Zeiker, so I think eloquently stated, and I quote, "The issue is whether regulatory agencies should be creating conditions in which they are forced to accept the recommendation of proxy advisor firms. The SEC has promulgated regulations which has led to an environment in which firms are forced to use proxy advisors. They're forced to adopt the recommendations of proxy advisors, and proxy advisors have no responsibilities in a fiduciary sense." This, Mr. Chairman, is a question that this committee must consider. Now to my questions, Mr. Shostal. After looking through your website, it's difficult to tell how Glass Lewis develops its policies and procedures to formulate its voting guidelines. Is there a particular reason why your firm does not disclose your historical recommendation data or how you formulate voting policies? Like, what engagement does Glass Lewis undertake with companies that are the subject of its proxy voting recommendations?
Thank you for your question. I appreciate. We could talk for 10 minutes about this, so I'll try to be efficient.
Well, we don't have that, so quickly.
Exactly. So we'll grapple our transparency around our process for voting guidelines first. We have, first of all, 43 regional voting guidelines globally to reflect.
You have no historical data, sir. None. You don't talk about how you formulate your policies.
I'll correct the record there. We do, and we provide season reviews actually, the team is now creating season reviews for the U.S. market. And there are historical data points, how we voted and how the market responded in terms of shareholder results.
But it's not how you got to the recommendation of your data. How do you engage with the subject of your proxy voting recommendations?
The data is available for our clients who choose to procure it, but we aggregate it because our clients want to know what the voting trends are. And I could be happy to share it with the subject.
Mr. Friedman, moving on, ISS conducted climate surveys of institutional and corporate issuers in both 2021 and 2022. Those surveys yielded a total of 329 respondents and 417 respondents, respectively. There are over 4,000 issuers in the United States. Do you believe that the few hundred respondents to your survey represents a meaningful amount of data to develop your voting guidelines?
Well, Congresswoman, the process by which we develop our policies and those guidelines really is open and inclusive. We do make that survey as well as—
But it's very minuscule, sir, very small. Because it seems to me that you're not collecting nearly enough input or information. Tell me, how does ISS formulate the survey questions it asks?
Those are questions that, first of all, we're looking at what new issues may be coming up in the market in terms of new corporate governance issues or issues that may show up on the ballot in the next season. So to get an understanding of how the market as a whole, our institutional investors—
Okay, let me ask you, what engagement does ISS undertake with companies that are the subject of its proxy voting recommendations?
We have processes to engage with corporations both during season and outside of season. And so our research—
Well, they don't think so. From what I can tell, ISS's website tells companies to engage through its, quote, help center. What type of engagements take place with the companies and shareholder activists?
Again, the process, Congresswoman—
On a help center? On a website that doesn't even have data on it? I mean, your own website tells companies to engage through your help center. Do you ever proactively reach out to companies to better understand the impact of shareholder proposals prior to making recommendations? Or does it only use publicly available information, for instance, that's available on the company's website? Now, I'm out of time. I would like that question answered. And I like my prior questions answered, and I have more to submit for the
Gentlelady.
record, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentlelady can submit that to the chair, which will pass along, and we anticipate timely responses to that. All right. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I want to talk about, because there are some, obviously, I don't know, anytime two firms control more than 90% of a market, concern is entirely appropriate. We know that. But I do believe, that targeted reforms are necessary. But I want to talk about some of the concerns that, that gets raised around the burden of shareholder proposals on public companies. And so to each witness, how many shareholder proposals do most companies receive annually? I'll start with you, Mr. Friedman.
Yeah, Congresswoman, I apologize, I don't have the exact number, but as I know Mr. Shostal mentioned in his opening testimony, the percentage of shareholder proposals as a function or as a percentage of the total number of ballot items that show up is extremely tiny. The bulk of the...
Yeah, as of 2019, most companies didn't receive any shareholder proposals in a given year. Is that right, Professor? If a company does receive a shareholder proposal, how many do they normally receive? So if they do take them in, it's like less than, go ahead, Mr. Professor.
Yeah, so, some old data maybe, but gives you an indication. I think 13% of the Russell 3000 companies got a proposal. That's once in 8 years, right? One divided by 0.13. So a lot of this relates to the very large caps, the Amazons and the Microsofts and the Teslas. If you look at the whole gamut, it's pretty small.
Well, how often are shareholder proposals binding on a company? Anybody know that?
Binding?
Binding.
Nothing.
That's right.
Nothing is binding. It's completely
right.
advisory. Yeah.
So now I want to talk about some of the benefits that have resulted from shareholder proposals, though. In many cases, shareholder proposals have helped establish what are now considered industry best practices, such as independent board leadership and annual elections for all their directors. So, Professor, can you discuss some of the policies that are today viewed as best practices that were initially driven by shareholder proposals?
Well, annual voting of directors, splitting the board, chair of the board and the CEO, which is still highly contentious, comes up every year in most companies and doesn't pass, and eventually, hopefully, will at some point. There are many proposals. For example, Wells Fargo, that's a classic case study. They actually, I think it was a New York pension fund that said we should have a clawback for all kinds of problems with Wells Fargo. Eventually, Wells Fargo blew up. So the idea that this is complete noise is, I think, overstated.
Absolutely. Mr. Friedman, you touched in your testimony, am I correct, that in overwhelming majority of cases, your company's vote recommendations are based on your client's voting policies?
Well, in all, yes, the overwhelming majority of votes are tied to a client custom policy as opposed to an ISS proprietary policy. That's correct.
Again, there's constant concerns and it's mind-boggling what I'm hearing. You guys are doing advisory work. That somehow you decide how their clients vote, and it's just so. Mr. Shostak, is it correct that your clients choose their proxy voting policy, including possibly their own custom voting policies that you then use to make your voting recommendations, sir?
Yeah, absolutely. In our experience, the vast majority of our clients select a custom voting policy.
Moving beyond the content of specific recommendation, whether or not a client of a proxy advisor actually follows the advisor's recommendation in another matter entirely. Mr. Friedman, Mr. Shostak, do your clients have to follow your recommendations? I know you've talked about that.
No, they do not.
That's right.
No, they do not.
How often do your clients follow through with any of your recommendations? Is it simply automatic?
It's not simply automatic. And again, recognizing that the bulk of the shares are tied to a custom policy, which the client has chosen, and even if it's an ISS proprietary client policy that they've chosen, you would expect generally, some alignment there, but they are not obligated to, and there's certainly cases where they do diverge.
Professor, what do you think this hearing is really about? You can tell us. Go ahead.
Well, to me, it should be about the state of U.S. corporate governance. I think proxy advisors are, as I said, not perfect.
No, what do you think? What do you think they're afraid of here? Shareholders that have information?
Well, the obvious answer is go private.
Yeah. No, seriously. Does anybody have any idea why we're having? we're guessing here. I'm really taken aback. There's no targeted reforms. There's no discussion. As if shareholders, they don't deserve information and guidance, and I don't understand what's going on here. Does anybody?
Well, if the contract is give me your money and go away, well,
That's right.
that doesn't
right?
work, yeah.
Yeah. Same thing with tenants, give us your rent, I don't care what the condition, I mean, it's just absolutely mind-boggling. It really is. I'm really disappointed that we're doing this. Thank you all for your time.
For informational purposes, this morning's hearing listed 20-some items of bills that were being explored regarding this issue. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit an article for the record written by Mr. Rajgopal expressing support for increased oversight of proxy advisory firms, including SEC registration and disclosure of conflicts of interest.
Without objection.
And Mr. Friedman and Mr. Shostal, yes or no, do you agree with Mr. Rajgopal that you should register with the SEC and disclose conflicts of interest?
Yes.
Proxy Advice is already regulated by the SEC, and on a global basis, we have a range of policies from conflicts practices.
I'll take that as a yes as well. Mr. Friedman, I'd like to discuss ISS's board-aligned voting policy. I find its name strange, considering that the policy is not truly a vote with the board policy. The policy will only defer to the board on specific proposals so long as the board's position supports what ISS perceives to be an, quote, adequate, unquote, ESG disclosure. Mr. Friedman, what metrics are used by ISS to determine whether an ESG proposal is adequate? And what is ISS's definition of adequate?
So, Congressman, the framework that we use, again, in that board-aligned policy is one, and it's not intended to be, and I don't think has been presented as one, that it will vote or support every single management resolution. I think, frankly, if that was an approach that a client of ours wanted, which they certainly would be free to take, we probably wouldn't need a distinct policy. But we're looking at the facts and circumstances of every resolution that shows up on the ballot, and whether it's the board-aligned policy or any of the other policies that we are applying on behalf of a client, the factors are laid out in those policies, and we apply those factors to the facts at hand, recognizing that every proposal is different, every company is different, and reach a recommendation on that basis.
Okay. Mr. Friedman, ISS's board-aligned policy guidelines state that it is focused on the, quote, creation and preservation of economic value, close quote. Shouldn't all policies for institutional investors be focused on this?
Yeah, and I believe that the policies are, but I do think there can be a divergence of views amongst investors, and for a range of reasons, because of their own investment strategies, time horizons, things that they think are more or less important, that reasonable minds can disagree when they make these assessments. And so that's the value, and in our experience, our clients who are institutional investors, sophisticated, who themselves have fiduciary duties, I think they are investing for value and voting based on value, but with recognizing how they assess it and think about it, there's a diversity of thought there, or can be.
And just to reiterate something you said there, your customers, both of your customers, are institutional investors, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Shifting to you, Mr. Shostal, why did Glass Lewis create the governance-focused policy?
From our client feedback, in fact, it was developed with a number of red state pension funds when the debate around pecuniary issues surfaced in the last 12 months. They gave us feedback. We implemented a policy that they could start using and then further customize. So it was a starting point so that a number of red states could leverage this thematic policy.
Okay. And Mr. Friedman, Mr. Shostal, for both of you, yes or no, doesn't the existence of these other policies call into question the objectivity of the benchmark policies?
I'd love to give more context, but the simple answer is no, it does not.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Does the existence of these other policies call into question the objectivity of the benchmark policies?
Absolutely not. I think it reflects the free market perspective that many investors have different perspectives. We need to develop different policies. I think there's an overabundance of focus on benchmark policy, but that, as we've said, does not reflect the majority of our clients that they're using custom voting policies.
All right, Mr. Friedman, in the remaining seconds we have here, when issuing recommendations under your board-aligned voting policy, has ISS made any recommendations against the board of directors' position on ESG proposals?
So I want to be, the answer is this policy is new, and I don't believe, and it evolved in.
My time has expired, so if I could, I'd like to get both of your firms to answer that question for the record. Thank you. I yield back.
With that, the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Williams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us today. My goal on this committee is to ensure that underserved and underrepresented communities have a strong advocate when it comes to issues that impact their economic mobility. As a Congresswoman from Georgia's 5th Congressional District, I represent many large, profitable companies headquartered in my hometown of Atlanta. Despite the success that these companies continue to have, Atlanta still has the largest racial wealth gap in the country, the entire country. There are countless obstacles that prevent people of color from building wealth, but a lack of agency over their investments should never be one. Hardworking Americans, and particularly marginalized individuals, deserve to have a say in the companies that they're invested in. Shareholder proposals play an extremely important role in allowing investors and marginalized people who are not represented on corporate boards to have a seat at the table. In fact, many common practices that improve corporate governance and increase profitability, like independent board leadership, board diversity, sustainability reporting, and non-discrimination policies, came out of early shareholder proposals. These policies are now widely considered to be best practices and are hallmarks of well-run businesses. Proxy advisors are essential to make sure that shareholders are fully equipped to vote based on their best interests and priorities. And apparently Republicans want shareholders to be as uninformed as possible, concentrating companies' decision-making power in the hands of a few board members and taking power away from investors. Limiting the input of marginalized people and placing all the power in the hands of those who already hold it is nothing new. Republicans in my home state of Georgia passed SB 202 in 2021, which preferences the type of voting by people they do like and limits the kinds of voting by people they don't like. The implementation of SB 202 in Georgia caused the largest racial turnout gap in decades, and now Republicans want to copy and paste this nationally and across all industries. This hearing is a prime example that they're trying to forcibly limit, once again, the voices of marginalized people and direct power to board members who share their policy positions and views. As I mentioned before, shareholder proposals are a critical tool used by investors and stakeholders, which raise material issues for companies that can save money and improve company performance. They provide an opportunity for shareholders, especially those from marginalized communities who have historically been shut out from corporate boards, to voice their views, a fundamental right for anyone who buys stock in a company. Professor Rajgopal, can you explain why shareholder engagement is a fundamental right for investors?
So as I said earlier, the contract in governance is that I give you money, capital, and what have you done for me the next year, or the next quarter? And one of the ways to get that dialogue going is a shareholder proposal. If you actually get rid of shareholder proposals, extreme things will happen. Either the number of lawsuits will go up, or you'll have activists like Elliott and the others banging on your door. So this is not a bad compromise, the system that we have right now.
And how do shareholder proposals provide an avenue to empower investors from marginalized communities? Do they have the potential to impact the racial wealth gap?
Well, maybe, so one of the ideas here is the license to operate, meaning, if you operate in a state or a municipality, implicitly, society gives you the license to go do that. So maybe that's the angle, perhaps, to motivate what you're saying.
Thank you. Mr. Friedman, you've been with ISS for nearly 20 years and cited in your testimony that ISS is a registered investment advisor under the Investment Advisors Act. This means that y'all are required to render advice that is in the client's best interest. One of the proposed discussion drafts would make changes to the IAA requiring a passive fund to vote in accordance with instructions from the beneficial owner, the issuer, or abstain from voting. How would this proposal hurt oversight of corporate governance by investors?
Well, I think, Congresswoman, I think ultimately the investors, and whatever the nature of the investors, their ability to have the information they need and to vote in accordance with what they believe is in the best interest of their own beneficiaries, I think is just critical. And so I would be concerned that anything that undermines that would be problematic for the investment community.
And how would this proposal sideline the interest of any investors from marginalized communities whose hard-earned money is invested in such a fund?
So, Congresswoman, I guess respectfully, I understand the question. It's not, I think, sort of to the point of ISS's role in what we do as being an information agent, not one that we really have an organization.
And I am out of time, but I will love to follow up on this with answers in writing. Thank you.
With that, I am going to request unanimous consent to enter an article from the Wall Street Journal, I believe it was today, cracking the proxy advisory duopoly without objection. I also will be submitting request for unanimous consent to enter a letter from the National Association of Manufacturers who testified earlier today in the Capital Markets Subcommittee to the record, highlighting the proxy firm's continued conflicts of interest, propensity for errors, and unwillingness to engage with companies. So moved, and I request unanimous consent to enter a letter to the record from the Business Roundtable highlighting concerns about the influence proxy advisory firms wield in the shareholder voting process, without objection. With that, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Thank you as well to our witness for appearing today. So proxy voting has been very highlighted this week by this committee and has proven to be an alarming situation. Proxy advisors, in theory, advise shareholders on how to vote and lay out their options. However, proxy advisors have demonstrated a bias aimed at furthering self-serving goals. The two firms, Glass Lewis and ISS, as we all know, make up about 95% of the proxy advising and voting. They advocate for ESG mandates and requirements, then get paid to manage ESG integration in the companies that they voted such mandates into, demonstrating what appears to be a conflict of interest and not the interests of shareholders who they provide such advice to. So, Mr. Shostal, Ernst & Young reported in March that ESG data generated revenues, showed that ESG data providers generated revenues in excess of $1 billion globally in 2021. This will rise. It's on the rise. In 2022, Glass Lewis launched ESG scores and data in their proxy paper to further highlight ESG themes. All the while, Glass Lewis revenue comes from its consulting with companies about how to manage their ESG integration.
We did launch, thank you for the question, we did launch ESG data points at the behest and request of our institutional investor clients who sought timely information, so data that was collected at the time of the proxy statement's release. So did a company evolve its DEI program? Did the company have a new climate action plan, for instance? We do not provide consulting advice.
So you don't solicit those that you consulted towards ESG?
No.
Okay. You have no contact with, you are a proxy advisor.
We use the data. The data can be used, again, to the point of custom policy for clients who choose.
So you have one door does the advisement and the other door across the hall does
There's no advisement, as I've stated. There's no consulting on ESG. Glass Lewis does not do consulting on ESG. The clients have sought data points
do the
that
proxy
are
voting,
actionable so that they can make voting decisions, but it is not used in the benchmark policy.
Okay, all right, you're under oath, right?
It is not used in the benchmark policy.
Okay, well, that's contrary to the information that we have. You folks
It
do
is,
the
it is
voting
used,
proxy, right?
it is,
Proxy.
it is informative. The ESG profile page is informative, but it is not used in the benchmark voting policy.
All right, so we playing word games here, or are we, those companies that you serve as a proxy advisor for, you then solicit to manage their ESG integration?
We don't do any consulting. We scrape the data from their proxy statements and their annual report at the time of the solicitation period, and we build a
Okay.
profile page.
Glass Lewis specifically references the fact that its proxy papers will include critical sustainability measurements of global compact score, ESG score, and business involvements. Glass Lewis simultaneously is selling ESG products and providing proxy voting research and recommendations.
So that institutional
So is
investors,
everything here I'm reading totally is incorrect?
so the institutional investors can use that data for custom voting policy application, not
No,
benchmark policy.
You don't have to hide your business.
Let me further explain what they use it for. They also use it for engagement purposes. So for example, if they identify a company that is a laggard in their view.
All right, we'll just have to dig into this further, won't we? Mr. Friedman, is it standard practice for ISS Corporation Solutions to solicit companies that receive the negative voting recommendation from ISS during the previous year? Does ISS Corporate Solutions impose, or, excuse me, just answer that question, please.
It is not a standard practice. No, but ISS Corporate Solutions, which is a
Okay,
subsidiary.
where do you get your revenue from?
Our revenue comes from a multitude of business lines, the
Do
proxy.
you engage in proxy voting for those so-called clients?
So to be clear, Congressman, we provide proxy research and recommendations to institutional investors. We have a subsidiary entity, the Corporate Solutions entity, which does work and provide services to.
It's alarming, any business that needs to dance around what its standard practices are for its work and its advisement and its actions and where its revenues come from, that's alarming too.
Congressman, with respect.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. With that, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize to the witnesses that I had to step out and I may have missed a couple of questions, but I'll try not to be repetitive of anything you've already been asked. First, I do want to thank you all for being here and responding to some of our questions and making your presentation, because I think that we can all agree that there is some sort of proxy advisory reform that is necessary. And I would love to work with my colleagues across the aisle on such measures. However, Republicans are going about reforms, in my judgment, in the wrong way today. It seems that once again, Republicans are siding with big business and corporate management by attacking proxy advisors simply because they offer advice and recommendations that may contradict corporate managers' wishes. This hearing today is another example of what some of our Republicans are calling so-called anti-woke agenda, attacking ESG disclosures and anything that contradicts big business and their wishes. If a proxy advisor offers a vote recommendation to a shareholder that contradicts a CEO's wish list, it doesn't automatically make it woke. In fact, I still can't figure out what woke really means. Let's be clear, proxy advisors serve an important role in the market. They offer independent advice and analysis on shareholder proxy votes. Proxy advisors often represent smaller investors, and they level the playing field for these investors who might not have the resources on their own to extensively research every single shareholder proposal up for a vote. I can tell you, I've looked at some of these, and even as a lawyer, I can't understand what they're saying. So with that in mind, I'd like to proceed with some questions, and I want to start with a professor. Professor, it's Rajgopal?
Raj, it's phonetic. Yeah.
I'll call you professor.
That's good.
You wouldn't believe this, but some people still call me Garza rather than Garcia, so I'm sensitive about that. So do proxy advisors always recommend in favor of climate or social proposals?
I need to go look at the data, but I would assume not.
You would assume not. So this whole kind of global statement that that's all that they're doing and they're harmful and et cetera, doesn't really stand up. Do you decide which shareholder proposals come up for a vote as a financial advisor, a proxy advisor?
I don't think they do.
You don't think they do? What factors do you think they consider?
Well, so they have qualitative data on the website, as was alluded to. Their models are proprietary, whatever math they do. So I'm guessing they're looking at CEO compensation, board structure, performance, something along those lines would be the three big ones, I would say.
So it's not automatic that they'll be a part of anything related to advancing an ESG or a quote-unquote woke agenda. They look at facts on their recommendations on everything that they do they not?
That's what I would do, and ESG is as pecuniary as anything else.
Okay. Now, I really cannot read your nameplate, sir. But are you the one with?
Stephen Friedman with ISS.
Right.
Mr.
The
Shostal,
same question.
Glass Lewis.
The same question.
And I'm sorry, Congresswoman, could you please repeat that?
Right. The advisors don't automatically recommend an ESG agenda or any quote-unquote woke agenda.
That's absolutely correct. And in fact, we have multiple policies, so on any particular issue, we may actually recommend different opposing vote recs to different clients who have chosen different policies and different perspectives. And then, of course, the custom policies where it really is exactly how the client thinks about that. So that's a little bit of a long answer, but the answer is that that's simply not the case, that we are supporting or recommending in favor of all so-called E&S proposals.
All right, so what criteria do you use for your recommendation, before you make a recommendation?
Again, the criteria vary according to the different policies, but fundamentally, we're looking at sort of materiality and looking at how things will impact the company. And again, it's really from the perspective of the shareholders and how they are thinking about those particular issues and how they choose to weight them.
Mr. Chairman, if the last witness...
Sorry about the gentleladies.
No, I'm asking if we could make sure that the remaining witness submit his response in
And you
writing.
submit the question to the chair, and we will pass that along.
Good, thank you. Sorry about, it's run out of time.
As we are anticipating a couple of other members, we are going to skip on the Republican side and go to Mr. Sherman, who is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Yesterday and today seemed to be a Republican-led attack on the free market system. Everybody who buys into a mutual fund can decide which mutual fund they go into. And if you think BlackRock votes its shares the wrong way, you can go to State Street, Vanguard. I don't have time to list all the choices. Then each of these companies can go to whatever investment proxy advisory firm they want. Professor, are there particular barriers to entry that prevent them from being a wide variety of proxy advisory firms?
So not a legal one, but there might be economic barriers to entry. If this is a low-margin business, who wants to enter? Right? I don't know whether it's a low-margin business, but I would hypothesize if it's a low-margin business, nobody wants to enter, perhaps.
I don't know what it would be a low market. I give advice away for free. So I'm in this market now. Free advice, how to vote any proxy. I just undercut the market. I'll ask the other two witnesses, starting at the far right there. Is there much of a barrier to entry to get into your business?
Congressman, we don't see artificial barriers to entry, and as I mentioned in my opening statement, there actually is a new proxy advisory service.
And that's Vivek Ramaswamy has created that, is that correct?
That's correct.
Is he known for being woke?
As I read about him, no, I would think and I believe he wrote a book, anti-woke.
Professor, do you think Mr. Ramaswamy qualifies as woke?
Not at all. He's colorful, but not woke.
So you can get advice from one side or the other. You can invest in one in one mutual fund or another. How else would these major firms go about deciding how to vote their proxy? Is there, well, I'll go back into history. Was there a time when the major mutual funds and pension funds would almost automatically just vote the way management asked them to? Professor?
Yeah, that's my understanding. Yeah.
Well, I can see why the most powerful people in America would like it that way. These are the managements of the biggest companies, and they want the shareholders to be hobbled and blinded and rubber stamp whatever they're doing. I'll ask the witness who hasn't responded to one of my questions. How else would these companies know how to vote if they didn't get advice?
To your point, it would be extremely costly and ineffective for institutional investors who specialize in developing investment products and to actually do the work of analyzing the thousands of agenda items.
Is there anything preventing someone creating a mutual fund that only invests in fossil fuels or always votes for fossil fuels? Professor, is there any thing that prevents you from creating the "we're asleep, we're not woke" mutual fund?
Vivek has a fund called Drill, which exactly does what you were asking about. DRLL, that's the ticker symbol.
They invest in fossil fuel and they consistently vote for a non-Biden approach on these issues. So we either have a system where investors get to do what they want with their own money, or we have a system where government tries to prevent that from happening in an effective way. And my God, the anti-capitalist party is the party that was once the party of Ronald Reagan, who would be so embarrassed to be here today. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stile, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Huizenga, for holding today's hearing and for waving me on to the subcommittee. The proxy advisors industry has some pretty obvious shortcomings, and Chairman Gensler's efforts to shortcut critical safeguards are fueling an ongoing wave of social activism. I think it ultimately hurts American investors, in particular those concerned about their retirement income. It's why I've introduced pretty substantive legislation regarding proxy advisors. The process would require a proxy advisor to make important disclosures about methodology, staffing, and conflicts of interest. It would also give companies the ability to correct false or misleading statements and alters and restricts the use of robo-voting. I think some of these are pretty common sense reforms to improve an industry with immense power over our economy, and in particular, Americans' retirement savings. And before I start my questions, Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record an editorial from the Wall Street Journal on this topic, a study by the Milken Institute, and 2 articles by Professor Rajgopal regarding my legislation.
Without objection, so moved.
I'd like to thank Professor Rajgopal for some of his supportive statements of my legislation. In your analysis, you wrote the following: registration seems like a pretty good idea to me, partly because it's ironic that an industry devoted to assisting institutional investors govern companies is itself highly opaque and unregulated. Is that right? You said that?
Oh, absolutely. That's what I said in my opening statement. Yep.
And 2, an interested user visits the ISS website will find next to no information about their revenues, segments under which the revenue is earned, and how ISS arbitrates between conflict in the provision of such services across both sides of the market they serve. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then previously you just said you think it's a low-margin business. How would you know that if you don't know?
I don't know. I said I don't know.
You don't know, so we're just hypothesizing whether or not it's a low-margin business. A lot of consulting businesses that I know are pretty high-margin businesses. I don't know either. The revenues are opaque. It's not reported. We're not under SEC oversight. I think we should be. That's what Chairman Clayton put forward a rule. It was obviously gutted by Chairman Gensler to allow our two largest proxy advisors to operate kind of in this opaque manner. And so if I can start with you, Mr. Friedman, in your testimony, you state that ISS provides institutional investors with objective, timely, and expert proxy research and vote recommendations. So if I can, I'm going to dive in on the expert proxy research. What's the process for formulating a vote recommendation? And does ISS conduct an analysis to determine if a proposal could induce an issuer to violate state or federal laws?
So, Congressman, thank you for the question. The basic process is we've got a global research team, and that team will take the policy at issue for the particular client.
Let me get to the specific though. Do you analyze whether or not the proposal would violate state or federal law?
That is not something that would typically be part of our analysis. And
so you don't review if something's illegal or not in your advice?
Congressman, there's a process when it comes to shareholder proposals with the SEC, to the extent that there's a variety of grounds upon which the SEC is able to advise a company that a proposal does not need to show up on the ballot.
Understood. So you just accept the SEC. So, for example, in the Traveler's case, I would say that would have required Traveler to engage in illegal behavior by pricing insurance based on race. The SEC allowed that proposal to go forward. Once the SEC allowed that proposal to go forward, there's no further check or analysis as to whether or not such a passage would be legal or illegal by ISS.
Well, I do think relying on the SEC's legal analysis, I think is...
So you rely on the SEC, no further check. If I come over to you as it relates to the Glass-Lewis side, do you have a further check as it relates to a legal or illegal action by a shareholder proposal? Do you review state or federal law?
We'll take into consideration. Matter of fact, I think we've engaged with Travelers, if you recall. So we had the opportunity to discuss with them their legal concerns. And we concluded, because it's a non-binding precatory proposal, that there were certain aspects of the proposal that we didn't feel necessarily warranted. But there were aspects of the company's, there were pecuniary issues. First of all, the company had some settlements.
Understood. Let me shift gears because I got such limited time. Do you analyze the best economic interests of shareholders when you analyze the shareholder proposals?
Would you like an example?
I'm just saying, it's a
yes. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, a water utility in New Jersey, recently headquartered in New Jersey, got a racial equity proposal, and we balanced the company's human capital management policies against what the company stated, $1.4 billion cost of implementing the proposal. And we've recommended against the proposal and supported management.
In cognizance of my time, I would just love to see more transparency in how you conduct the analysis under which you do. I think additional transparency would not only benefit you, I think it would benefit the American people. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
With that, the ranking member, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Permit me to ask a couple of questions. Mr. Friedman, I'll start with you. Sometimes diction can have an impact on one's perception. To call someone an activist investor conjures up a certain image. Would you give me an example of the typical investor that you happen to represent? By the way, investors are owners. So we're talking about activist owners now, people who actually own the business. Give me an example of a typical owner that you might represent.
So, Congressman, thank you. Our clients are institutional investors, period, and they really are a range of investors from small, medium, and large. You could expect.
A small, give me the size of a small.
I
just give any small.
I mean, it could be an investment advisor who has a small shop with a handful of employees, up to the largest asset managers in the world, and everyone in between.
Largest in the world, give me an example in terms of dollars associated with that being capitalized.
Oh, I don't have that information.
Well, just an estimate. I'm not holding you to it.
Congressman,
is it billions? Are they worth?
I would imagine it's billions, if not trillions.
Billions, if not trillions of dollars.
Please don't quote me on that.
So they're not typically people walking around with a sign protesting outside of of some corporation that they'd like to see change policies?
That's not my assessment of our client base.
Okay, well, all right, thank you very much. Let's go to the next gentleman, please. Your clients.
I think institutional investors have different perspectives on what may be material, whether it's, we discussed it.
But without getting into that, I'm just interested in the size right now, the size.
So as Mr. Friedman shared, there's going to be a broad range of investors. Some large pension funds, for example, European large pension funds may be more active or activist, and conversely, there are going to be some much smaller.
These large firms, do they have lawyers?
I would imagine so.
Do you think they have accountants?
I would imagine.
Do they have in-house advisors?
Again, don't quote me, but I would imagine so.
I don't assume that you check off a list, but if you're a billion-dollar company, you probably do. A battery of lawyers, more than likely. So do you find that they are well-equipped to ask the appropriate questions related to the advice that they seek?
In my experience, yes, based on once they've evaluated what is material in their investment belief and philosophy, that then trickles down not just into the investment process, but into the stewardship and voting and engagement process.
Now, I have a document that was published by my colleagues on the other side. It evidences some of the legislation that they're proposing. There's an HR that doesn't have a number, that's a bill, to authorize the exclusion of shareholder proposals from proxy or consent solicitation material if the subject matter of the shareholder proposal is environmental, social, or political. If that is enacted, could that have an impact on some of the clients that you might represent, Mr. Friedman?
Well, ultimately, our clients vote, and as it relates to the service we provide, it's whatever is on the agenda. So to the extent there are more or less or different proposals on the agenda, it certainly would be an issue for them to consider. But where we sit in the process is to help them within the framework of their chosen policies to assess those agenda items.
I understand, but this proposal would exclude environmental. If you had an insurance company, would it be of some benefit to them to know about environmental issues in Florida, for example?
Yeah, and I think I think many shareholders would find that to be extremely valuable, but in fairness, there's some who may not see.
Oh, I understand there'd be some who would not, but those who do, that contact you, you do represent them too, don't you?
We do provide services to a range of institutions, yes, that's correct.
And finally, do you find that your clients believe that evidence related to diversity and inclusion is important? Yes or no?
For many, it is.
For many, it is, yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Okay. Gentleman's time has expired. I appreciate the witnesses for giving us their time today and their testimony. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, excuse me, which will then be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask them to please respond as promptly as you are able to do. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.